At just 29 years old, she was a Silicon Valley titan and a self-made mogul worth $5.2 billion. Yet there she was, balancing a silver tray and dodging insults from the city's elite. For one night, she endured the cold arrogance of a man who treated her like she was invisible. A man who thought his dark past made him the most powerful person in the room. He had no idea that the clumsy waitress he just insulted was the anonymous donor who just signed a $50 million check to keep his empire from collapsing. Simone Carter adjusted the heavy tray of champagne flutes, her face a mask of professional neutrality as she navigated the Emerald Heart Gala. To the titans of industry whispering in the corners, she was just another uniform, a background character in their play of power. What no one in that ballroom knew was this: Simone Carter wasn't looking for a job. She wasn't looking for a tip. And she definitely wasn't looking for their approval. She was the hidden force behind the evening's multi-million-dollar initiatives, and she was taking notes on every person who crossed her path. Tonight, the invisible waitress was about to become the center of their world, and Park Joon-woo was about to realize he just made the most expensive mistake of his life. The silver tray felt heavier than its physical weight, a polished disc of sterling silver that acted as a shield and a mask. As Simone Carter moved through the grand ballroom of the Emerald Heart Gala, she wasn't just carrying vintage Bollinger. She was carrying the secret of the entire evening. To the guests, men in six-figure watches and women draped in high jewelry collections, she was nothing more than a moving fixture, a silent extension of the catering staff. It was a strange, cold freedom to be this invisible. She moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, weaving between clusters of venture capitalists and real estate moguls. A man with a booming voice and a flushed face reached out without looking, snatching a glass from her tray before she could even offer it. He didn't offer a thank you. He didn't even break his sentence about quarterly projections. To him, the hand providing the drink was no more significant than the table it had sat upon moments before. Simone's eyes, sharp and observant, flickered toward the Emerald Heart logo embossed on the silk wall hangings. She had spent 6 months vetting the charities this gala would fund. She had personally approved the $50 million endowment that was currently paying for the very caviar these people were mindlessly consuming. Yet in her starched white apron and modest black slacks, she was a ghost in her own house. "More napkins, girl, and move faster, the terrace is parched," a socialite snapped, waving a manicured hand toward the outdoor lounge. The woman didn't look at Simone's face, only at the tray. "Of course, madam," Simone replied, her voice a low, melodic simmer. She felt a flicker of amusement beneath her professional exterior. This was the litmus test she had designed. She wanted to see who these philanthropists were when the cameras weren't flashing and the tax receipts weren't being signed. She wanted to know if the city's elite cared about the humanity they claimed to serve, or if they only cared about the optics of the donation. So far, the results were dismal. She adjusted the tray, her fingers brushing the cool metal. Somewhere in this room was Park Joon-woo, the man whose reputation preceded him like a winter storm. He was the final piece of her puzzle. If he was like the rest, the night would end in a very public lesson. If he was different, perhaps her $50 million wouldn't be the only thing changing the city tonight. Simone took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and turned toward the VIP section. It was time to see if the wolf in the expensive suit was as blind as the sheep he led. The atmosphere in the ballroom didn't just change when Park Joon-woo entered. It curdled. The frantic, high-pitched chatter of the socialites dropped into a respectful, heavy hush that followed him like a physical wake. He didn't walk so much as he claimed the floor beneath him, his presence radiating a cold, magnetic authority that made the titans of industry suddenly look like nervous schoolboys. He was dressed in a suit of midnight wool that seemed to absorb the glittering light of the chandeliers. His face was a masterpiece of controlled indifference, high cheekbones, a sharp, bladed jawline, and eyes that held the terrifying stillness of a predator who had already won the fight. This was the man who had supposedly traded a life of shadows for the legitimacy of corporate boardrooms, yet the air of the underworld still clung to him like a dark cologne. Simone stood near a marble pillar, her silver tray balanced with effortless poise. While every other woman in the room adjusted her pearls and every man straightened his tie to catch his eye, Simone remained perfectly still. She wasn't looking at the cut of his Italian jacket or the power he wore like armor. She was looking for the crack in the stone. She watched as a minor real estate developer practically tripped over his own feet to offer Junwoo a greeting. The reformed boss didn't offer a hand in return. He merely offered a slow, predatory blink that sent the man scurrying back into the crowd. Junwoo was a man who understood the currency of fear, but Simone was looking for the currency of character. Was there a soul behind that icy facade, or was he just a more polished version of the thugs he used to command? As he moved deeper into the VIP section, his gaze swept across the room, dismissive and bored, until it passed over the catering staff. For a split second, his eyes met Simone. Most people looked away from him in submission or stared in hungry ambition. Simone did neither. She looked through him, her expression as unreadable as a deep well. He paused, a momentary hitch in his predatory stride, his brow flickering with the faintest shadow of curiosity. To him, she was a servant who didn't know her place, a girl who forgot to lower her eyes. To her, he was a billionaire on the verge of a very expensive lesson in humility. The stage was set. The wolf had entered the fold, unaware that the quietest lamb in the room was the one who owned the meadow. The air in the VIP lounge was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and even more expensive desperation. Simone moved through the cluster of elite guests, her silver tray now a target for those looking to exert the only power they had, social cruelty. It happened in a blur of silk and spite. Genevieve Vance, a socialite whose primary talent was spending her husband's hedge fund earnings, pivoted sharply, her beaded clutch catching the edge of Simone's tray. With a calculated flick of her wrist, Genevieve sent a crystal flute of vintage champagne tumbling. It didn't just fall, it shattered against the marble, spraying amber liquid across Simone's sensible black shoes and the hem of Genevieve's pristine cream gown. The gasp that rippled through the immediate circle was performative, a collective intake of breath designed to draw blood. "My dress!" Genevieve shrieked, her voice cutting through the jazz quartet's melody like a jagged blade. "You clumsy, incompetent girl! Do you have any idea what this costs? More than you'll make in 3 lifetimes of serving drinks." Simone remained perfectly still, the shattered crystal glinting like diamonds at her feet. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She simply looked up, her gaze steady, watching the mask of charity slip off every face in the circle. Then the crowd parted. Park Junwoo stepped forward, his presence cold enough to freeze the spilled alcohol on the floor. Genevieve immediately softened, her face shifting from rage to a damsel's pout. "Junwoo, look at this. These people. They have no business being in a room this refined. They ruin everything they touch." Junwoo didn't look at the dress. He looked at Simone, his eyes tracing the line of her jaw, searching for the fear that usually greeted him. Finding none, his expression hardened into something brittle and cruel. He was a man who valued order above all else, and to him, Simone was a glitch in his polished evening. "She's right," Junwoo said, his voice a low, resonant scrape of gravel. He didn't raise his tone, which made the words feel heavier. "You are a blemish on the aesthetic of the evening. Clean up the glass, disappear into the kitchen, and try not to remind us of your existence again. Some people are born to lead, and others are born to scrub the floors they walk on. Know your place." A ripple of cruel laughter followed his pronouncement. Simone looked down at the shards, a small, private smile tugging at the corner of her mouth, a smile no one noticed. She had seen enough. The reformed boss was just another man who mistook a uniform for a soul. As she knelt to pick up the first piece of glass, she felt the weight of the $50 million check in her mental ledger shift. Park Junwoo had just bought himself a lesson he would never forget. The humiliation wasn't enough for the guests of the Emerald Heart. They wanted it digitized. As Simone knelt on the cold marble, the first soft click of a camera shutter sounded, followed by the glowing rectangular halos of dozens of smartphones. In the age of viral cruelty, a clumsy waitress being rebuked by a reformed Mafia kingpin was content gold. "Look at her," Genevieve whispered, loud enough for the microphones to catch. "She's actually touching the glass with her bare hands. How desperate." Simone moved with a methodical, almost meditative calm. She picked up a jagged shard of crystal, the sharp edge grazing her thumb, but she didn't flinch. Above her, the circle of philanthropists had turned into a firing squad of lenses. They leaned in, capturing the contrast of her stained uniform against the opulence of the ballroom, their faces twisted into smirks of secondary-hand superiority. They weren't just recording a spill, they were recording a social execution. Park Jun-woo stood at the center of the ring, his arms crossed, his silhouette imposing and dark. He watched the phones go up with a faint, bored curl of his lip. He was a man who understood the power of an image, and right now, the image was clear. He was the sun and she was the dirt. He didn't stop them. He didn't offer a hand. He simply stood there, a monument to the very elitism Simone had spent her life trying to dismantle. "Make sure you get her face," a young tech heir laughed, adjusting his gimbal. "The invisible girl finally makes a scene. This is going to be the top post on the city's social feed by midnight." Simone looked up then, not at the man speaking, but directly into the lens of the nearest phone. For a fleeting second, the person behind the screen hesitated. There was no shame in Simone's eyes. There was no tearful plea for mercy. Instead, there was a terrifying, quiet intelligence, a look of someone who was counting every face, logging every laugh, and filing away every digital receipt. They thought they were documenting her shame. They didn't realize they were building the evidence of their own moral bankruptcy. They were filming the woman who owned the building, the foundation, and by the end of the night, the very ground they stood on. As the flashbulbs continued to pop, Simone dropped the final shard onto the tray. The sound was a sharp, metallic chime that signaled the end of the first act. The digital record was complete. The world would soon see exactly how the generous donors of the Emerald Heart treated a human being when they thought no one important was watching. Little did they know, the most important person in the room had seen everything. The sharp, crystalline ring of a silver spoon against a flute silenced the room more effectively than a shout. The jazz quartet tapered off into a haunting final note, leaving a vacuum of sound that swallowed the whispers and the cruel snickers of the crowd. Every phone that had been angled down at Simone's knees now tilted upward toward the velvet-draped stage. The CEO of the Emerald Heart Foundation, Marcus Vane, stepped into the golden glow of the spotlight. His face was flushed, not with champagne, but with a reverence that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. He looked out over the sea of tuxedos and gowns, his gaze lingering momentarily on the VIP circle where Park Jun-woo stood like a dark pillar of judgment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice amplified and trembling with a weight that commanded absolute attention. "Tonight is not merely a celebration of our collective efforts. It is a night of profound revelation. For 3 years, this foundation has been kept afloat by a ghost, a single, anonymous benefactor whose vision has built the schools, the clinics, and the hope that we all claim to represent tonight." A murmur rippled through the guests. Even Jun-woo's eyes narrowed, his boredom replaced by a sharp, calculating hunger. In his world, $50 million was more than a donation. It was a seat at the table of the gods. "Many of you have spent the evening asking who this patron of the heart could be," Marcus continued, his eyes searching the back of the room. "You have looked for them in the front rows. You have looked for them among the names on the Forbes list. But our benefactor wanted to see the truth of this room. She wanted to see who we are when we think no one is watching." Simone stood perfectly still by the marble pillar, the stained silver tray still gripped in her hands. The liquid on her shoes was cold, but her blood was a slow-moving fire. She felt the shift in the room, the sudden, frantic checking of social status, the nervous smoothing of dresses. "She is the reason we are here," Marcus's voice rose, vibrating with a triumphant edge. "And she has decided that the time for anonymity has ended. It is my greatest honor to introduce the true owner of the Emerald Heart, the woman who single-handedly funded the $50 million endowment we celebrate tonight." The silence that followed was deafening. Every head turned toward the stage, waiting for a titan to emerge from the wings. No one looked toward the server's station. No one looked at the clumsy girl with the broken glass at her feet, except for Park Jun-woo. As the CEO's hand extended toward the shadows near the servant's entrance, Junwoo's gaze snapped back to Simone. For the first time that evening, the ice in his expression didn't just crack, it shattered. The silver tray clattered onto a side table, the sound echoing like a gavel in the unnatural silence of the ballroom. Simone didn't look at the tray. She didn't look at the shattered glass still shimmering on the floor. Her eyes were locked on Park Junwoo, whose face was a pale mask of dawning, horrific comprehension. With a slow, deliberate motion, Simone reached for the knot of her stained white apron. The movement was fluid, devoid of the hurried subservience she had worn all evening. As the ties loosened, the starch-stiff garment slid from her shoulders, pooling at her feet like a discarded skin. Beneath the drab server's black slacks and cotton shirt lay a secret sewn in silk. She reached for a hidden seam at her waist, and the rough outer layer of her uniform fell away to reveal a gown of iridescent sapphire. It was a masterpiece of midnight blue, encrusted with hand-stitched diamonds that caught the light of the chandeliers and threw it back at the crowd in a blinding, rhythmic pulse. The fabric moved like liquid shadow, flowing around her silhouette with a structural elegance that silenced every breath in the room. This wasn't just a dress. It was a statement of absolute, untouchable sovereignty. Genevieve Vance's phone slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud that no one noticed. The socialite's mouth hung open, her gaze darting from the stained apron on the floor to the woman standing before her, a woman who suddenly looked as if she could buy and sell everyone in the VIP lounge without checking her bank balance. Simone stepped out of the discarded pile of the help, her posture shifting. The humble curve of her shoulders vanished, replaced by the regal, iron-willed spine of a woman who had built an empire from nothing. She reached up, pulling the simple clip from her hair, letting the dark waves tumble down her back in a cascade of effortless power. The cameras that had been recording her clumsy mistake were still rolling, but the smirks had vanished. The tech heirs and real estate moguls looked at their screens in terror, realizing they had just broadcast their own cruelty to the world, featuring a billionaire as their victim. Park Junwoo remained frozen. His dark eyes tracked the shimmer of the diamonds on her gown, his mind racing to reconcile the blemish he had just insulted with the titan now radiating light in front of him. Simone didn't wait for him to find his voice. She didn't need it. With the grace of a queen reclaiming her throne, she began the long walk toward the stage. Each step was a silent strike against the marble, a rhythmic countdown to the social execution she was about to deliver. The silence in the ballroom was no longer respectful. It was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide, heavy with the collective realization of 100 ruined reputations. Simone ascended the stairs to the stage, the sapphire silk of her gown whispering against the wood, the only sound in a room that held its breath. Marcus Vane stepped back, his head bowed in a gesture of profound deference as he handed her the microphone. Simone took it, her fingers steady, her gaze sweeping over the sea of pale faces. She didn't look at the crowd as a whole, she looked at the individuals. She looked at the tech heir who had mocked her, now sweating beneath his collar. She looked at Genevieve Vance, who looked as though she might faint into her spilled champagne. Finally, her eyes settled on the front row. They locked onto Park Junwoo. Tonight was a test. Simone's voice rang out, amplified and chillingly calm. It wasn't the voice of a waitress. It was the voice of a woman who commanded industries. The Emerald Heart Foundation was built on the premise that those with the most should care for those with the least. But as I moved among you tonight, I didn't see philanthropists. I saw vultures in silk. A collective shiver seemed to pass through the guests. Simone turned her body slightly, isolating Junwoo in her sights. The spotlight followed her gaze, pinning him in a cold, white glare. "Mr. Park Junwoo," she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming a private blade intended only for him. The use of his full name felt like a physical strike. "You spoke quite eloquently earlier about place. You told me that some are born to lead and others are born to scrub the floors you walk on. You told me to disappear." Junwoo's jaw tight, his legendary composure finally fraying at the edges. For the first time in his public life, the man who feared nothing looked small. I have spent the last hour watching you and your associates treat the help as if they were part of the architecture, Simone continued, her words cutting through the air. You seek legitimacy for your empire, Junwoo. You seek a seat at my table, but you have forgotten the most basic rule of power. You do not judge a person's worth by how they serve you. You judge it by how you treat them when you think they have nothing to offer you. She paused, letting the weight of his own words crush the room. My $50 million check didn't just fund this gala, she said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, brilliant light. It bought me the right to see your true face. And now that I've seen it, Junwoo, I find your place in my world to be exactly where you put me, beneath notice. She lowered the microphone, the feedback a sharp, final sting. The social execution was complete. The gala was over, though the ghosts of the evening's insults still seemed to vibrate in the air of the private library. Simone stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her sapphire gown reflecting in the glass like a deep-sea bruise. The heavy mahogany door creaked open, and the scent of expensive tobacco and cold rain followed Park Junwoo into the room. He didn't enter with his usual predatory swagger. His shoulders were set in a rigid line of damage control. He stopped several paces behind her, his reflection appearing beside hers in the window pane. Simone, he began, his voice stripped of its earlier bite, replaced by a low, desperate gravel. The things I said, they were a performance, a necessity of the circles I must navigate to keep my business legitimate. I didn't know it was you. Simone didn't turn around. That is the most honest thing you've said all night, Junwoo. You didn't know it was me. You thought I was someone who couldn't fight back. You thought I was someone who didn't matter. I am here to offer a formal apology, he pressed, stepping closer. And a proposal. My shipping empire is at a crossroads. With your capital and my infrastructure, we could dominate the Pacific trade. I'll double your endowment. I'll put your name on every dock from Seoul to San Francisco. Simone finally turned, her expression as cool and unyielding as the diamonds at her throat. She held a thin, translucent tablet in her hand. With a flick of her thumb, she sent a file to the large monitor on the library wall. You're late, Junwoo, she said quietly. While you were busy telling me to scrub the floors, my team was busy scrubbing your ledgers. The screen flickered to life, displaying a cascade of red flag transactions, shell companies, and the very shadow connections he had claimed to leave behind. Junwoo's face went ashen. Due diligence is a quiet process, Simone continued, her voice a silk-wrapped hammer. I didn't just go undercover to see if you were polite. I went undercover to see if you were worth the risk. I've already seen your tax returns, your offshore holdings, and the way you speak to people who can't do anything for you. I don't need your proposal because I already own the debt on your 3 largest vessels. The silence that followed was heavy with the sound of a crumbling empire. Junwoo realized then that he hadn't just insulted a waitress. He had handed the keys to his kingdom to the one woman who didn't care for his crown. You wanted to know my place? Simone asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. My place is holding your future in my hands, and I've decided I don't like the weight of it. The silence in the library was absolute, the kind of silence that exists at the center of a storm. Park Junwoo stood amidst the wreckage of his pride, his gaze fixed on the screen that detailed his own vulnerability. He had spent a lifetime being the man who held the leverage. Now he was merely a man waiting for a sentence to be passed. Simone walked toward him, the sapphire silk of her gown rustling like a warning. She didn't stop until she was inches away, forcing him to look down into eyes that held more power than any street gang or corporate board he had ever commanded. You have 2 choices, Junwoo, she said, her voice a calm, melodic steel. The first is that I walk out of this room, sell your debt to the highest bidder by dawn, and watch as your legitimate empire is stripped for parts by the very sharks you tried to impress tonight. Junwoo's throat tightened. He knew she wasn't bluffing. Simone Carter didn't make threats, she made executive decisions. And the second, he managed to ask, his voice strained. The second is that you become the man you've been pretending to be, she countered. I will keep your creditors at bay. I will provide the capital to stabilize your shipping lines, but in exchange, you are no longer the master of your own house. You will be my junior partner, not in trade, but in transformation. She moved to the mahogany desk, sliding a single, thin contract across the polished surface. 70% of your quarterly profits will be diverted to the Emerald Heart's urban renewal projects. Your fleet will become the primary logistics arm for our global aid relief. You will use your influence to dismantle the very systems of fear you helped build. Junwoo looked at the paper, then back at her. You're asking me to give up everything I've built. I'm asking you to justify why you should be allowed to keep any of it, Simone replied. You wanted a seat at my table. This is the price of admission. You will learn to serve, Junwoo. And you will start by realizing that the place of a leader is at the feet of the people who need them most. For a long moment, the former Mafia boss searched her face for a hint of hesitation or a flicker of mercy. He found only the unwavering resolve of a titan. Slowly, he reached for the pen. His hand, which had never shaken in the face of a blade, trembled slightly as he signed away his autonomy. Simone picked up the document, the ink still wet. She didn't offer a smile, only a nod of professional acknowledgement. The power dynamic had flipped so completely that the air in the room felt different. The predator had been domesticated by the very prey he had sought to humiliate. Good, she said, turning toward the door. Report to my office at 6:00 a.m. And Junwoo, don't bother with the midnight wool suit. We're visiting a construction site in the East End. Wear something you don't mind getting dirty. She walked out, leaving him in the shadows of the library, finally understanding that true power doesn't need to shout to be heard. It only needs to wait for the right moment to speak.